There we go. All right. So, so classes in PHP then. I'm not going to torture you by explaining what classes and objects are. If you passed Java, hopefully you have an idea of that. So, behold a class in PHP. Note, where's my marker wand? Where is my marker wand? Ah, here it is. So, classes are of course declared with the class keyword. You give the name to the class. If you're inheriting anything, you can expect where you would put that. Within the class itself, we declare variables and functions the same way that we would in normal PHP. So we have function foo, which does some stuff we don't have to care about. So, unless the class is static, you have to create an instance of the class to get a reference to an object using the new function. The variables associated with your object, or attributes, are unique to your object, but all the objects will share the functions. So, this is how you create an instance of a new class in PHP. You will see that this now starts to travel somewhat into Java-like territory with the new keyword. That being said, this is still PHP, so data types are still necessarily absent. Any questions so far?
Can I ask you a quick question?
Yes?
When you do JSON.decode and you don't do true, so returns as an object, does it automatically do it for you, or is it just like a temporary object? Because if you do JSON.decode, you put a variable to equal JSON.decode, and then you do comma true, it makes it an array. But if you don't do comma true, it makes it an object. And then you can do like the arrow stuff. So does it do all that stuff automatically for us, where it has like the function in that and everything's defined?
Oh, no, it just creates an object with no methods.
So it's like just like an anonymous object basically, or something like that.
Well, it's not anonymous because you've assigned it to a variable,
Yeah.
right? So the variable's name is its identity.
But it's not an actual object type.
Well, it is an object type. It bears the most resemblance to a struct, actually. If you're familiar with structs from C or C++.
Like typedef struct?
Yeah, well, yeah. Question?
Would you be able to unlock the page?
Oh, yeah, that would be a great thing to do. Sorry about that. Yeah, so it bears the most resemblance to a struct in that it's a collection of, let's see here, where are we? Yeah, there we go. There we go. Sorry about that. Where were we? Oh, no.
You're showing the declarations for like the objects.
Yes, there we go. Thank you. So, remember that I said that in PHP objects are made on the fly, right? It is possible to create empty objects. All right? So you can create an object that contains nothing. No variables, no methods, no nothing.
It's just assigned that type, right?
Yeah, well, what you do is you add stuff to it the same way you add a new element to an associative array, right? You assign to a new value and that adds it to the class, or adds it to the object. So, like, and it's kind of terrible because like things work kind of in this manner in JavaScript as well. You know, so the JavaScript empty object is actually one of the 6 characters you can use in that minimal language in JavaScript that I can't actually say the name of that can express any program. So you can create empty objects. You can add stuff to them as the program is running. That includes both variables and methods, right? So basically that's what JSON decode is doing if you're in object mode, is it creates a new blank object, it slots each of the values in the JSON, all of the pairs, into it, right? And then basically from there the only difference is, do you access these through indexing, or do you access these through our new equivalent of dot notation, which is incidentally arrow notation. So, any other questions? That was a good question. So, so let's talk about constructors and destructors in PHP. Things are beginning to look quite a bit like a Python object, aren't they? Or a Python class. So, within the inherited definition of object, which PHP is working with, there are, of course, a certain number of methods that everything has. Constructors, destructors, probably some form of toString. We override those definitions by declaring a function of the same name. In the case of constructors, the function's name is underscore underscore construct, and in the case of destructors, underscore underscore destruct. So things work, about the same way here that they would anywhere else. A constructor, your knowledge of constructors from Java is broadly applicable here. Make sense? Any questions? Yeah.
Not about constructors, but what's the difference between print and echo?
Ooh, not much.
They're just aliases.
Yeah, they're aliases. PHP is one of these languages where, it was a collaborative effort among a larger number of people. There's not really a strong centralizing authority in PHP like there is in Python. Python, one of the design ethics of Python is there should only be one way to do something, which is of course silly because it's a programming language. But Python is trying to avoid these problems of we have both print and echo. We support elif, elsif, and else space if. It's trying to be more uniform as a language. But that's also possibly as a result of Python having a supreme dictator for life, which is the actual. His name is Guido van Rossum, and he's from the Netherlands, and he is the supreme dictator for life of Python. That's. I used to think that term was funny, and then I learned actually that's a common term among these software projects, that one person is designated the person with ultimate authority, because otherwise you have the PHP problem where there are literally 5 different ways to print something. Yeah.
But wouldn't you say that printr is special though, because it can take an array and just prints all the values of the array or the object?
Oh, specialty print functions are different.
Oh, you just mean specifically just print and echo?
Print and echo are direct synonyms,
Okay, sorry.
and there are a number of those that occur in PHP, right? More than you might think, as a matter of fact. But yeah, WordPress, which is the reason everybody thinks that PHP is popular when it actually is less popular than people think it is, because the back end of WordPress is PHP, but when you make a website with WordPress, the whole goal is to not have to program in PHP, right? So, but, PHP runs an amazing amount of stuff on the internet. It's yes, because half of all of the websites are WordPress, right? So PHP is on the back end. It doesn't mean that that's what everybody's programming in, right?
Like IBM.
Yeah. So, anyway, what was I talking about? Destructors. What was your question again? Did I answer your question?
Yeah, pretty
Yeah.
much.
Okay. Stuff like printf that has a specific use, that's a little bit different. But yeah. So you'll notice you also have the name of the class as a specific keyword within a class. You'll probably never need that again, or I need to know that ever again. So let's talk about probably the most important portion of this topic, which is how on earth you actually get something out of an object in PHP. Because if you were, if you were thinking, oh, things are like broadly speaking the way that everybody else does them, you would be inclined to think that you would do object.attribute in PHP. But what does dot mean in PHP?
Concatenation.
String concatenation, and PHP absolutely hates sharing its operators, right? It hates overloading operators, which is like the one exception of the rule that there are a million ways to do everything in PHP. So, it's probably, that's probably baked in so deep that it was just very difficult for anybody to change it, and that's why it's still like that. So, instead of object.attribute, we have object arrow attribute. So we have hyphen greater than, intending to form an arrow. This is different from the arrows that we use to construct associative arrays. That one is a double line arrow, this is a single line arrow. Do you want to know why?
Sure.
Okay, it's C programming again. So, when you have a structure in C,
Isn't an arrow pointer?
let me finish.
Sorry.
So, let's say I create a struct in C called, car, yada yada yada, doesn't really matter, right? I declare, so in C you don't declare an object of that type usually. What you do is you declare a pointer to an object of that type, right? So you would say car pointer my car is equal to, in C it would be malloc, or memory allocate size of car. That would set aside the place in memory for the car, but not instantiate it. You would then, basically C supports both dot and arrows as applied to structs. So if this was my car too, and I had just a straight car, my car, which, you would populate with the values. If you wanted to get anything out of the non-pointer version of car, you would say my car dot wheels, right? If you wanted to get the same variable out of the struct, the pointer to the struct, you would have to first dereference the pointer and then access the value. So you would need to dereference my car to, and then access wheels. Over time, people became tired of doing this, and so the following was introduced in a year or two later as syntactic sugar in C for the same pointer operation. So the arrow in C means pointer dereferencing plus field access. Hello. No trouble. So, in technical point of fact, when we create a variable for an object in an object-oriented language, are we creating the object itself, or are we creating a reference to an object?
You're creating a reference?
Yes, typically. For example, in Java, this is the distinction between a declared variable of a particular class and the new, equals new object line, right? So the difference then with the in technical point of fact, arrow is more correct if you're trying to maintain how things work in C in other languages. However, it is of course 2 characters instead of 1, and we hate doing more than 1 character for anything, right? But that's, technically speaking, when you access the field of an array or the field of an object inside of Java, you are performing a dereferencing on the reference and then accessing it. But since in an object-oriented language, like references have become a lot more primary in the language, it's kind of like practically everything's a reference anyway, unless it's a primitive. So so they just use dot for everything.
So if I get what you're saying right, you use the arrow like that because it's essentially the same thing that we're doing in like C with pointers, and then we use the equal sign because that's different because we're assigning. Is that what because you're saying the difference between the equal sign version of like the pointer and the arrow, and then just like the hyphen version.
Oh, no, the equal sign version of the arrow is for associating things inside of an associative array.
Yeah, I mean that's why I'm using a different thing instead of just like the arrow because it's referencing that.
I mean, it's a related concept, but my gut instinct tells me that associative arrays are handled very differently from objects in the sort of under the hood.
And that's why they make it because that was the point while you were doing the thing.
Yeah. Otherwise, like decoding. Otherwise, there'd be no point in choosing whether you're decoding a JSON as an object or an associative array if associative arrays were just objects.
Oh, okay.
Right?
Yeah, that's right.
So, if the types were completely compatible in that way, there'd be no point in the distinction. But, one might ask PHP to pick one for Pete's sake, but that's okay. So, does that make sense? You access methods the same way. Does that make sense? Have we belabored the point sufficiently? Awesome. So, one brief note on inheritance. In Java, you had the keyword super. The equivalent in PHP is parent. And I believe that's also the case in Python. No? Does it not use parent in Python? Is it still super? Ah, okay, all right. In that case, I rescind. I rescind my previous statement. In PHP, you use the extends keyword to create an inheritance relationship, and private, public, and protected works the same as in Java. Though, we do have a sneaky little new piece of syntax which is being introduced somewhat sneakily. Double colon. Alright? So, any C++ programmers in the crowd? A little bit? You will have seen the double colon before then. What does it mean?
I'm not actually sure what it means.
Ah. Sorry? Constant? No, it doesn't mean constant. 2 colons. So, essentially, it's a way of navigating namespaces. So, if you don't know what a namespace is, it's okay. Java doesn't really use them. So, in certain object-oriented languages, most particularly C++, you can take a group of classes and organize them under a particular namespace. In very large systems with lots and lots of classes, you will probably want to have several namespaces because one of the things that you may wish to do is have the same object name as applied in different places, right? Or the same class name in different places. You can specify things by namespace. So the 2 colons allows you to navigate from one namespace. Basically, namespaces are also organized into a hierarchy the same way that classes are. So you can navigate down through various namespaces by using the double colon. Question?
So it's just basically the same as navigating folders using the dot notation that you go up a folder.
Oh, it doesn't go up, it goes down. But
goes
yeah,
down,
it's a very similar idea to folder navigation, yeah. Does that make sense? They have a strange name for it in PHP. Or perhaps it's the name for it, but it's very difficult to pronounce. What? What do you mean? Alright, I'll Google it then. PHP, there we go. So, it's called the scope resolution operator, also the Hamayim Nekudakayim, or in simpler terms, the double colon.
How many people call it that?
I read somewhere that, yes, this is, there you go. This term would at first seem like a strange choice for naming a double colon. However, while writing the Zend engine 0.5, which powers PHP 3, that's what the Zend team decided to call it, and it actually does mean double colon in Hebrew. So there you go. So that's there you go. The double colon operator, courtesy of the Jews. So. Scope resolution. We won't have to use it very much, but when we get into the PDO object, there are a couple of constants that are defined in there that we'll need to access using the scope resolution operator.
Yeah, that's what I was asking, like, what they constant, because I know it's whenever you like the PDO, like, most especially they are constant, so you go on for
Mhm.
That's why I assume it was like constant.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, that double colon is scope resolution.
Okay.
So, good. Sometimes you run across like a language construct and you're like, this probably only exists because the thing is difficult to work with and this was originally a workaround for something else. And scope resolution operator seems like one of those to me. Except C++ is a bit like wizards in that they are never late nor are they early. They arrive exactly when they intend to. So, yes. Any questions about objects in PHP in a general sense? Okie dokie. Oh, yes.
You speak what on object, the PHP object. So, is this still referred to like the STD object? Because I noticed before you do the code, like with the JSON of the code, when you put it, if you don't specify true, okay, it's recognize the object as an STD object. So, is a typical PHP object an STD object, like a standard object, or?
Yeah, that seems, I'm not sure particular, like I need to look into it, but that seems correct, yeah. That's probably their name for like the global object. But here, let's see if the PHP documentation has anything to say about that. PHP.net STD, let's see what, STD class, yeah, I know I'm looking up STDs on the internet.
Isn't that just standard functions for like C++? Like you can print to the console
So-
for STD and all that?
Like there's a whole class of standard library functions that have the STD prefix, most notably stdio,
Yeah.
which is like a very, very important C standard library function for input and output. It allows the program to write to the standard output strings, which are standard output streams, std out and std in and std error.
And then use the arrow thingy.
Yeah, so, yeah, it seems, let me see here. So the std class, a generic empty class with dynamic properties. Objects of this class can be extended. This is not a base class in PHP. It does not have a concept of universal base class. Oh, interesting. However, it is possible to create a custom class that extends from standard class and as a result inherits the functionality of dynamic properties. Okay? Okay, so it avoids having to have one base object class from which everything inherits, but this seems to be the one, like, you know when I was saying earlier that what JSON decode is doing is creating an empty class and then dumping things into it as it decodes the JSON? It seems to be an instance of this is what it creates. So, So yeah, so I would imagine the reason that it's dumping, the reason that it's inside of the std namespace is that that's probably an alias for like main in Python.
Okay.
Yeah. So like the main object in Python does basically the same thing. Every line of code in a Python file is technically inside of a class.
Yeah.
It's just inside of a class by default called main, and that's, people think that like Python doesn't have a main function, but it does. It's just defined as being the whole file,
Yeah.
right?
Is all that underscore name equals to name.
Yeah, exactly. So, yeah. Any further questions about objects before we move along? So, I should reiterate, this class does not expect you to construct anything using objects in PHP. Some of you are like, whew, and not just because it's way too stinking hot in here. The purpose of giving you all of this information is, number one, for completeness. And number two, you are expected to use the object. You are expected to use a couple of objects now that we're getting into databases. So you got to know a few things, basically. So, yeah. So rather than diving immediately into the course notes on this, I think I'm going to show you some practical stuff first. As everybody in the room, hopefully this is still true, there are a few people who came late. Everybody has done databasing or is doing databasing? Yeah? Good. So, basically the opening section here is on CRUD operations and how to do them in SQL, and I will lovingly skip that section if it's completely redundant, because we have more interesting things to talk about. So, what actual software do they use for databasing these days?
MySQL.
MySQL?
Yeah, we're just like this SQL, I think it's in 2019.
Okay. So is that like a standalone application then?
Yeah, SQL 2019 Express is what we're using.
Okay. So let's talk a little bit about servers then, because it sounds like that's a standalone running locally kind of version of it, yeah? So first and foremost, SQL is the name of a language, but it is also the name of a packet type. So we have HTTP packets. What does HTTP stand for?
Hypertext Transfer Protocol.
Very good. And the S means?
Secure.
Secure. We also have SQL packet types. So if you were to view an SQL packet in URL address bar form, it would say SQL : / etc., etc. So, SQL packets are received by and processed by SQL servers, right? Much of the time, depends on the size of the application, but much of the time, an SQL server will reside on the same physical machine as your web server, right? It's simply that you have one computer system. It shunts HTTP packets in one direction, and then it shunts the SQL packets in another direction. So recall that a server is a piece of software, not a piece of hardware, right? The server runs on a computer, right? The computer, therefore, is capable of running multiple servers. So, So if we take a look at XAMPP, our ever trusty XAMPP, which will hopefully actually load this time. We've been sort of skipping over the button most of this semester, but you will notice that under the XAMPP control panels, control panel singular, we have both Apache and MySQL as server types that we can run, as well as a FileZilla thing below and a few other ones that we don't really care about. So we should start our web server and our SQL server. Incidentally, does anybody care to take a wild guess what the packet type for FileZilla is? What type of packet is that servicing? Any guesses?
FTP.
FTP is correct, yes. Does anybody know what FTP stands for?
File transfer protocol.
File transfer protocol, yes. So, good. So MySQL will run on your local XAMPP installation. On CS Unix, there is also there is an SQL server running which services all of the student accounts. So, primary difference between your XAMPP and CS Unix. Here, we have one server and you're the only person using it. On CS Unix, there is one server and all of the students are using it. So, basically, on MySQL, on XAMPP, your default login credentials will be exactly that, default login credentials. It would be username, root, password is blank, right? Doesn't need to be secure because it's running locally on your own local host. It can't service packets from the internet, right? On CS Unix, your credentials to be able to access it are in fact the same as your credentials to log in using an SSH connection or an FTP connection, right? So the same username and password that you use to upload all of your work to CS Unix, those same credentials are what you need to access your SQL account on CS Unix. Make sense? Don't worry, we'll go over it a number of times. So, in the case of MySQL, there is a certain amount of work that must be done to configure the database before we do anything useful with it. We need to be able to create our tables, for instance. In the XAMPP control panel, we have an admin button on MySQL, which, if clicked, redirects us to localhost/phpMyAdmin. This, when accessed directly through the XAMPP control panel, it automatically logs you in. User is root at localhost, and you'll just have to take my word for it for the moment that password is blank. Any questions so far? So this is very likely a different interface from what you're used to, but so long as you know where to look, all of the same stuff is there because you guys are doing MySQL Express and this is also MySQL. Make sense? Incidentally, you want to know why there are so many different SQL programs? Did they tell you this in databases? Are you interested?
Yes.
Yeah, sure.
Because it seems like kind of a pain in the ass, right? Yeah. So, basically, the reason for this goes back to the way that intellectual property was handled, of course, right? Back in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, prior to the open source movement, right? So, and it's not just PHP. or PHP. It's not just SQL. This is also applicable to C itself, right? Because you may notice there are actually several C compilers, right? The most popular one is GCC, the GNU Compiler Collection, which is packaged with Linux, Linux and probably Mac as well. IBM has their own version called Clang, and Windows has the Windows C compiler, which of those three is the only one that's not actually compliant with the specification. There we go. So, essentially, back in the day, you would design a specification such as the SQL specification or the C specification. You would then license the specification to another company to produce an implementation, right? So, to take C again, the C standard was taken up by IBM and the compiler was produced. The same specification was taken up by the GNU guys, right? The new GNU project, and they made their own, right? I'm sure back in the day you had Bell Labs' original C compiler, right? But that's how like these software companies would make money, is like it would cost money to license the specification to have your compiler, right? So different specifications were at different levels of rigor, shall we say. So the C standard is a very good standard. Most programs that compile under Clang will compile under GCC. The only thing that will sometimes be different is sometimes something that's given as a warning in Clang might be an error in GCC or vice versa, but the definition of a correct C program is the same across the two of them, right? You get slightly different game-breaking bugs in the two versions. But largely, these two things they're perfectly harmonious in most other respects. That's because the C standard was written very carefully and very diligently, and very little room for interpretation was left in the standard. Compare that to the standard for SQL. So, the SQL standard, while it does specify a certain range of basic functions, leaves a lot more room for vendor-specific add-ons, right? So basically, what happened after the SQL specification came out was, all of your different people, Oracle and, all the rest of them, can't remember the company names. They all made their own version of SQL with slightly different feature sets, sometimes more than slightly different feature sets. They all have to serve the same SQL specification, so all of these different flavors of SQL are broadly compatible so long as you're not doing anything very complicated, like the CRUD operations and likely anything else that you've learned in your databasing course so far, very likely to be universal across SQL implementations. But the more you get into the weeds on it, the more you start using a particular vendor's specific add-ons, the less transportable your code is from one to another, right? And that, my friends, was the problem that C originally solved. Back in the 60s, back in the early 60s, you had this interesting problem with computer programs where if you had a program, the whole thing would have to be rewritten for each architecture you wanted to compile it on. Because, first of all, most of the time you were programming in assembly code, And second, every processor has a slightly, and perhaps more than slightly, different set of basic instructions, right? So if you're programming in those basic instructions yourself, unless you somehow know what the common set of basic instructions for all processors is, you know, you're going to have to re-implement your code for every architecture that you want to run it on. This, of course, greatly slowed down, you know, the rate of software being sold, because basically every time you sold a piece of software to a client, you needed to package that with a software developer who would implement it for that client, right? C comes along, and C is like, hey guys, here's a thought, right? What if we wrote compilers for everybody's stupid architectures, but the program itself was architecture independent, right? So this strong idea of universalization was baked into the idea of C right from the outset, which is why it has such a strong and stringent specification, because, you know, the more wiggle room they put in it, the more they were going to reproduce the same problem they were trying to solve, right? Question?
So you're saying, like the low-level languages back then were more machine-specific, while like from C, like a higher-level language was machine-independent. Is this in summary?
Yeah, so it's not that C was the first language to attempt this, right? You had, of course, programming languages at the same level of abstraction prior to C. C itself is based on a language called B, and it's also based on a language called BCPL, both of which function reasonably similarly. The thing that really sets C apart was, well, two things really. One was that strong drive towards standardization, so that you could write the program once and compile it anywhere, which is kind of like the same idea behind Java originally. Java was like the concept of the Java virtual machine was basically the same. Write your Java code once, run it anywhere you can get a virtual machine running, right? These days with programming languages, that's just taken as a given, right? But the second reason that C became so popular is because it came packaged with Unix, right? So Unix was an extremely important step in operating systems. It pioneered a lot of things we absolutely take for granted these days, like even simple things like a hierarchical file system. That was originally developed for Unix, right? And of course, Unix stole ideas from a few predecessors. But basically, Unix and C were given to educational institutions for free, right? Which meant that it proliferated. Everybody who was like an up-and-coming, you know, nerd was at a university spending time, you know, spending their hours whenever they had their hours in the computer lab, you know, plunking out C programs, because back then, and this may shock you to know this, right? You've heard that computers took up a whole room, right? But perhaps you've not like thought about the implications of that, right? These rooms were like strongly scheduled, right? You had X number of hours with the computer, and then you were out, the next person gets their turn on the computer, because like the university has like 2 computers, right? And so, you know, sometimes these slots, like to make more space in the schedule, these, you know, some universities would run these schedules right straight through the night, which is where computer programmers originate. Like that's where this sort of meme that computer programmers like work through the night, that's where that originally came from, is because we had to share computers with people, and we sometimes could only get our time at the terminal at 2 a.m., you know? So yeah, Unix was like extremely popular because it was free in an era before free software was really a thing, right? And of course, when I think it was Oracle took over Bell Labs, they decided they were going to try charging for Unix. What then happened was everybody, all of these programmers who like grew up on Unix and C were like, I'll just make my own. And that is how OpenBSD and eventually Linux were born. So, again, licensing. Licensing and copyright rule the world, man. Question.
Yeah, so is that why C# has the MSIL?
What's the MSIL?
It's basically replaces assembly, where they basically have like a thing where they take any language, they convert it to like Microsoft's, it's like Microsoft something, and then it goes into its CLR, and then it actually sends it to machine code the computer. So they have like their own version of assembly that's specific for like Microsoft. So they take any language as long as it's in the .NET thing, and then give it to the computer. Do you think that's based off of the same reasoning?
Well, I mean, like after C existed, once C existed, it completely set the bar for compilers. Can you imagine these days if you had to write your program for every separate architecture? Exactly. It'd be even worse than the time zones problem, right? So yeah, no, like, fortunately, we stand on the shoulders of the giants who are the graybeards who set these systems up for us. We don't have to think about writing the JVM or anything like that. And honestly, probably, like C# is how old is a language now?
Like 30%?
Yeah, like, I assure you that Microsoft probably hasn't had to worry about these problems in 30 years either, right?
Oh, it's 24.
It's-
July 2000.
Ha! 24, there you go. I mean, 24 is pretty close to 30. I mean, you know, if it were a person, Zoomers would call it a boomer, so,
Yeah.
you know. So, anyway. So there you go, that's a little bit about how compilers work and all of that from a business standpoint. I hope that was an interesting digression for people. I know I have all my digressions, but I try at least for them to be interesting. So anyway, so we are confronted with PHP MyAdmin. Again, you like all, it's kind of like, this is getting to be a bit of an old well, let's see if I can update the reference. So, I don't actually know about this, but like, you know in Dark Souls, you had like Titanite, and then in Bloodborne, everything was blood themed.
Bloodstone.
Yeah, Bloodstones and the rest of it. In Elden Ring, are they using Titanite or are they using something else?
They usually like Titanite again because everything went back to Estus Flasks, but you don't have like herbs or anything anymore.
Alright, well, the comparison is similar here, between here and what you've been using. Like everything that exists still exists. It's just a matter of where they put it and what have they named it, right? So here, along this bar, on the left side, we have a hierarchical view of a bunch of cylinders. Everybody should know what cylinder means in computer science now. What is a cylinder?
Database?
A cylinder is a database. Yes, it is supposed to look like a disk, like a hard disk. So, we have, just to take a random example, if we open up one of these default databases that we started off with, you can see we have a whole bunch of tables, right? Databases contain tables, same as you've had before, right? Tables contain entries and are built with schemas, right? Now, you do have a bit of an ooey gooey gooey. I don't know, in databases, do they show you how to like make a table in a database from SQL itself directly?
Yeah.
Yeah. So let me preface this by saying there's an SQL tab, right? At any point, if you want to do your work in SQL itself, you open up the SQL tab, you can create a query, and then you can execute it on your database here by clicking Go. So you have access to SQL right there. Okay? But because you have a bit of a GUI, it is perhaps useful to use it. So for our purposes, let's make a new database. You can click the new button at the top of the databases list to do this. Give the database a name, MyDB, perhaps. Don't worry that the language is set to Latin 1 Swedish. Don't worry, your database will not come out in Swedish. It will be in English, or because it's really what you put into it. Has something to do with the character set, I don't know. So that creates a new database with no tables. Fair enough, right? Once we have our database created, we can add tables to it. So I'm going to make a new table, call it video games. Number of columns, 4 is fine. Notice that it's having you say how many columns you want prior to specifying like what types they are. This is not actually set in stone in this interface. You can modify the number of columns on the next screen, but you know, it likes to know up front for some reason. So there we go. It gives you a whole bunch of blank entries, and you have to do something with them. So let's get an identification number, a name, system, for the system it was originally released on, and, I don't know, rating? Sure. There we go. So let me show you. Let me show you how to set up a few of the tags that they probably drilled you on in databases. Basically, a lot of it comes down to drop-downs here. So default is how you set what the default value for the field is, either null or current timestamp. You can make a integer signed or unsigned here. Index is where probably a few of probably you've talked about primary and unique, right? Yeah. So primary is of course primary key. Unique is is the unique specifier in SQL. That's how you add that stuff. AI is kind of an interesting one. It's not artificial intelligence. It's auto-incrementing. So, have they done auto-incrementing primary keys with you folks?
Yeah.
Yeah? Okay. So basically, here's your checkbox. If you want an auto-incrementing primary key, that's how you get to it. Boop. There we go. Now, if you do that, it will ask you, it has to keep a certain amount of data as well. It gives you this dialog screen. I think if you just click through it, it's fine. There you go. Yes, I think that's most of it. Is there anything that I didn't cover that you're interested to see how this system does it? Is that sufficient? Okay, yep,
So this is just exactly like what we're used to working with, just a different GUI.
it is still MySQL.
Perfect.
Yeah, it is just a different GUI, really. You know, we'd like to think that there is at least a little bit of coordination between the courses in the program. So, here you go. At this level, at least, we have some coordination. Yeah, so, oh, I need to pick data types. So, data types are also probably exactly as you would expect them. If you haven't seen it before, these guys might have a bit more meaning here than in the databases class. So do you know what blobs are? They're kind of funny, right?
Isn't it?
It's binary data, right?
Yeah, it's binary data. So if, for example, you wanted to save an avatar JPEG or something, an avatar PNG for a user account, but you wanted that to be in your database and not just like stupidly hanging out in a folder on your server, like a dummy, then you would use a blob data. You would use blob data on the server to be able to put that in and be able to take it out again. Incidentally, if you're doing AJAX, it's the same name. If you're sending binary data as the payload in an AJAX call, then you're also using blob as the type for that. Make sense? But aside from that, ooh, polygons, nice. Aside from that, probably most of what you'd be interested in is int, varchars, and possibly floats and booleans. You know, our standard data types so far. So let's make that a varchar, no more than 64 characters. System, let's make that a varchar, perhaps no more than 32 characters. Rating, we will make that an integer, that will do. And then, in order to create the table, we of course click save. There we go. Oh, some errors, uh-oh. Oh, I bet this was that primary key thing. Alright, so let's see here. Yeah. Alright. Let me try that again. It really is boiling in here. Like it's gotten worse like in the last couple of minutes. Outrageous. I am offended. If we can't even get the correct temperature in this room, how on earth are we going to beat the Russians?
That's what I'm saying.
So I think I just neglected to indicate a size. I think that was the issue. No. Use key isn't part of this. Goodness me. There we go. Come on. And it seems to have worked for that time for no apparent reason. Okay. So, this is your table view. This is the view of all of the tables in the database. You are unlikely in the course of this course to have more than like 3 going at any given time. To view the actual honest-to-goodness contents of your table, you simply click on the table name and you see we currently have an empty one. So if you wanted to insert something into the table, note that you have a number of buttons here that will partially construct your queries in an automated fashion. So if I want to insert, boy, that saved me a lot of time, didn't it? Let's say I'm inserting some values. I guess we don't, so we don't actually have to, if you've made ID a primary auto-incrementing key, then you don't have to add it, right? So, give me the name of the video game.
Stellaris.
Stellaris. Yep. System, that would have been PC. Yeah. And that's a game that tries also very hard to be PC. Rating, what would we give Stellaris?
10 out of 10.
10 out of 10? Yeah?
Steam says it's a 9 out of 10.
9 out of 10?
Screw that. 10 out of 10.
Wash your mouth.
But it's an integer. I can't do a point.
That 9 rounds up to
Alright.
10.
Alright, everybody who thinks Stellaris is a 10 out of 10? Everybody who thinks Stellaris is a 9 out of 10? Alright.
I've never played the game. I don't think I've ever heard of it until Simon brought it up.
Yeah. I don't know, it seems like they've been updating it, but I just can't with Paradox games anymore.
No.
No, like, I just can't. They're too long. I have other things to do like play Factorio. Speaking of which, Factorio dash space age. I would give that a 12 out of 10. What's another video game?
Street Fighter 6.
Street Fighter 6. Fighter 6, there we go. Originally released for probably a bunch of stuff. A bunch of stuff.
Everything but Switch, I think.
Yeah. That's good, yes. Everything but Switch, including potatoes. Rating on Street Fighter 6, what do we think?
Like out of 10?
Yeah,
I'll give it a 7.
7 out of 10, sounds good. And how about one more? Someone give me a video game. Tekken. There we go. Original platform,
Like, arcade.
PlayStation.
Oh,
Yeah, arcade, but you know. Rating on Tekken?
like the current one?
I'm assuming that if it's PlayStation, we're talking about the original one.
Oh, the original one? Give it a 10.
No, 6.
6? Whoa.
Yo! No!
There was a combat when it comes to like Tekken, so it's 6.
Bro,
I'll
they're
split the difference, we'll give it an 8.
They're on Tekken 8 now because the first one sucked. Alright, whatever.
Alright.
To be fair, Tekken 3 is way better than
This is fun, so one more. Give me a good video game. Let's hear your controversial video game opinions. Yeah.
Bloodborne?
Bloodborne. Bloodborne with an E. Original, again, everything but Switch.
Actually, sir, I'm pretty sure Bloodborne's only on PlayStation.
Was it play? That wasn't the original.
It's only been on PlayStation. It's like you.
Yeah, it's on
Which one? Like PS3,
PS4.
PS4?
Or no, might have been. I don't know. They just been sitting on that IP for too long. Everybody wants a remaster.
Yeah, I mean, I heard it was like it came out back in like the era when you could still do like Let's Plays on YouTube, and I remember watching Let's Plays of Bloodborne. It seemed like a pretty cool game.
You can still
It's
do
a
Let's
very
Play,
good
it's just
game.
not if you play Nintendo games.
Yeah, I don't know. It seems like the whole market's just kind of
Yeah.
things are not the way they were in 2015.
Well, COVID's also gone too, and that was like,
Yeah.
If you
Yeah.
wanna
Yeah,
make
that- that-
money, you gotta.
But the industry screwed up to begin with. It's all, they don't release a whole game, they release a third of it and they make you pay for the rest and it doesn't work.
Well-
This Bloodborne was complete.
What do we got for Bloodborne?
It's on a scale out of 10, right?
Yeah.
I'll give it a 13.
Okay, I'll give it a 13, sure. And okay, we have too many good video games. Give me a bad video game.
Bad Rats.
What is it?
Bad Rats?
Bad
Play
Rats.
Bad Rats?
I was gonna say.
Oh, Bad Rats. Bad Rats. There we go. Original. That would have been a PC one,
Yeah,
I
it
think.
barely runs on there too.
Fallen Sim 6.
-2. There we go.
That thing came out.
All right.
More like
Go. There we go. So now we have some data. IDB, video games table. We now have all of our data. Ta-da! So, let me show you two additional very key features here, which will be extremely useful. Import and export, right? So if you go to a database, such as the one we just created, and then you click export, we can yeah, just click go. Don't worry about templates. You can extract out the SQL file that will reconstruct your database. If you take a look inside of it, you will see that it's actually kind of just, it's literally just all of the SQL commands that we just did to create the database, all in one thing, and that's, that's it. You've probably seen these in your database in course, I assume, right? So, yep, that's how you export. Let's say just in the interests of destroying all of your beautiful data, if we destroy the database, i.e., basically every time you fire up XAMPP, you'll be starting with a fresh one of these. So, especially if you're like swapping between different PCs. But basically just remake a new database, give it whatever name, create, import, choose file, oh, where did you put it? I'm gonna export, no table, I lost the file, documents? No. Downloads? Yes! It was in downloads. That's stupid. Okay. Although I guess this is technically the internet. Go. Blunk. The machine goes blunk. You go back, and there is all of your stuff. Okay? So that's how you load, that's how you save, that's how you load to your local machine. Okay? So, good. Any questions about any of that? Okay, good. So, all right. So now we have a database, we have a table. It is possible that we may wish to read this data in PHP, given that this is the course on PHP. So, we access this data using the PHP data object. This is gonna be one of these things where it's not so much like I have to like be intimately familiar with every single command we're about to do and read the entire documentation and also take it out for dinner and meet its parents. You can memorize the procedure in bulk, reproduce it on the test, I guess reproduce it on the exam, and if you nail it accurately, then that'll be like, yay, full marks, right? There are a few ways of going about it. I'm only really concerned that you learn one good one, and that you don't use any of the bad ones, okay? Because using a bad one in this case can and will result in SQL injection attack. We are not going to talk about SQL injection attack yet. It is more important that we get something functional running. So, pulling back into the notes. Yada, yada, yada. Yada, yada, yada. Select commands, who cares? Okay. Yada, 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 yada. There we go. So, this is important. You will know that this is important because I have 4 fingers raised to heaven to tell you that this is important. All right? I am gesturing madly. This is important. This piece of code connects to the database using the PDO object. All right? So we create a database handle the same way, or the same way we create a file handle, we create a database handle, except in this case the database handle is a PDO object. The incoming arguments to the PDO object are the database you are connecting to, as well as your username and password. All right? So, let's copy that into a new PHP file. I'm going to use Notepad++ because I am done with VS Code. I've had too many lessons interrupted by it this semester. So, if we go to Windows, htdocs, let's make a new folder. Call this dbaccess.php. There we go. Throw that in. Now I'm going to show you how to configure it. So, in the same way that it makes sense to take your file name during file I/O and put it in a variable at the top, the same logic applies for your login credentials and indeed the location of the database you are attempting to connect to. So, let us first consider what host should be. So, you can see that the default here is localhost. For XAMPP, the SQL server is operating on the same machine as the web server. Therefore, with reference to the web server, the SQL server is localhost. Right? Makes sense? here's one to bend your noodles. CS Unix. Remote server with respect to the client-server relationship. So from my browser to CS Unix, that is no longer localhost. I must go through, csunix.mohawkcollege.ca. But with respect to the web server, let me back up a sentence. So with respect to my client, the SQL server running on CS Unix is also at csunix.mohawkcollege.ca. It's a remote server. But the MySQL server running on CS Unix is local with respect to the web server. Right? So, in other words, if this is my client on the left, and this is CS Unix on the right, CS Unix. I'll draw it big. CS Unix is running two servers. Well, more than two, but it's running these two servers. It's running its web server, and it's running its SQL server. Web server is also an HTTPS server. Right? So far, so good? With respect to the client, the web server is a remote source, not localhost. However, does the PHP run on the server or the client?
Server.
Server. Basic question at this point in the course, but people need to be reminded more often than they need to be taught. So, the PHP, you can think of it as like a section of the web server, right? The PHP interpreter. That is running on the remote server, on the same machine as the SQL server. Therefore, with reference to the PHP, this SQL server is also localhost. So you might think, if I'm running this PDO command on XAMPP, I'm connecting to localhost, because obviously everything is localhost. But when I move this to CS Unix, I will have to change it because it's a remote service. That's actually not the case. Localhost will be it in either event. So the question is, why are you even given the option then? Right? Let's assume that we have a third server in the mix. Let's say we have, well, it wouldn't be a file server. That would be more of an FTP thing. I'm just trying to think of a fun little name for it. Perhaps we'll call it Cheeseland. Cheeseland, which is a database server. The database server is also running an SQL instance, and it might be running a few other things as well. But if our CS Unix PHP instance had to connect through the internet to another SQL server, you have to go out through the internet, connect here, then, and only then, would the PHP no longer be connecting to localhost. It would be connecting to whatever the domain would be of Cheeseland, perhaps cheeseland.co.uk, because England has some pretty good cheese. So, does that make sense? That's I know it seems a little basic, but it's important to understand those distinctions. So, fortunately, that's not the case for us. There is no separate Cheeseland server, but we are connecting to localhost in either event. So here's a question for you. Why might I want to separate my SQL server from my web server? Yes.
If you breach the one, then you're not necessarily breaching the other one.
Yeah, that's not a bad one, yeah. A data loss in one server does not necessarily mean, like if they're on different machines, you
Or
can
if they breach,
insulate.
yeah.
Yeah, what were you gonna say?
Pretty much the same thing, security reasons.
Mm-hmm.
I wanna say maybe performance.
Performance? Well, in the sense that if you have a server that's only running an SQL server, it's got no other processes to attend to. So, like, yes, it would be able to serve SQL faster if that's all it was doing,
Yeah.
right? There is nothing else competing for resources. Yep. Another big one is scale, right? So, you know, it's all well and good for our little mom and pop websites, but consider the servers that somebody like, you know, Facebook, Twitter, or perhaps OpenAI have to work with, right? There is a kind of a functional limit on the number of hard drives you can stuff into a computer, right? You can only connect so many, like, SATA ports and that kind of thing. So, you know, there is a physical limitation. At a certain point, you have to parallelize, and you have to work with additional computers, right? So, further to that, let's say, like in a theoretical sense, you're able to construct a server with infinite hard drive space, right? You're also going to be limited by the number of CPUs, right? Your processing power also limits how many packets you can serve, right? So having multiple servers is also the only effective way to scale, to operate one of these like big data applications at scale. Make sense? Good. Wonderful. So, very good. Furthermore, so after we select the host to be localhost, we also have to select a database name. This is, of course, not nearly so complicated. My explanation will not be nearly so long. It is simply and purely the name of the database in my PHP MyAdmin. Connecting to this server, you've got a lot of databases available. This is, you have to pick one, right? And that's the one. So, in our case, it would be MyDB. Next, we have to provide login credentials. Now remember that these are servers. We need to provide, we need to have an account, we need to provide credentials. Accounts can be privileged at various levels. On XAMPP, again, that default is root and an empty password. So, there we go. Echo server connection successful. So, I know that we haven't really talked about exception handling in PHP. PHP has kind of been like drug kicking and screaming into modern programming by things like the PDO object. So PDO object returns exceptions, if you can imagine that, if things go wrong. And so we have a try catch, right? They work the same as in Java.
I was gonna say it's using get message as well. Does it also have like get stack?
Yeah, you could tell that whichever programmer put this thing together for
They use
PHP,
Java.
they were a Java
Yeah.
fan.
Okay.
Yeah. You remember that thing I said like some time ago? Like, when in doubt, program like it's Java?
I don't. Oh, okay. Sorry.
Yeah. So,
Yeah, because it's actually a try catch and yeah. Okay, sorry.
yeah, it's very Java-like,
Yeah.
right? So, all well and good. Let's run this and see that we are getting what we expect to. Localhost 1080/8 EV access, server connection successful. And of course, let me show you what it looks like when it fails. Maybe my database name is mydv or dk. There we go. Error, could not connect, SQL state unknown database, mydk. So there you go. And if you get only that much, you will have come, within 50% of completing last year's assignment 3, or assignment 4, pardon me. Yeah, so in terms of the assignment loadout for the rest of the semester, assignment 3 will be sessions, and then assignment 4 will be databases with maybe a little bit of REST API stuff thrown inside
Is
there.
that the last assignment?
Yes,
There's only 4?
correct.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So, good. So let me copy paste a little code in from the slides quickly, and maybe we can actually get some, maybe we can actually get some output. I'm gonna see if I can speed run getting output from this thing now. So select star from insert mode. Select star from video games. So I will explain all of these things. I just have very, very little time, and I want you to see the data, Oh yeah, it's statement. Fetch all. There we go. Array string conversion. I know. JSON encode it. Ta-da! So, as you can see, connecting to the database, you can get the data out of the database. I don't have time to go through all of the commands used. Here's the 2-minute version. First, we set up a string with the SQL query itself, save that to a variable called command. We then use the prepare method, which is a member of the PDO object. We put the command in there. Then we call statement execute, which executes the prepared command. Then the data which is returned from that operation is stored again in the statement object and must be extracted using either fetch or fetch all. The purpose of this PDO fetch assoc is to specify whether, again, we are fetching them as associative arrays or as objects. Any questions?
So, I guess I'll just throw this out. When we do multiple commands, do we have to put it for each new string array, like each line, or can we just put an entire long thing, like?
Multiple SQL commands may be executed using a special, I think, execute all command and a string containing semicolon separated SQL things. But honestly, I think that for our applications, if you're doing more than one SQL command, you're probably doing too much. Yeah, like our operations, like on the SQL side of things are going to be hella simple.
Okay.
Yeah, like we're not going to step outside of our, like I'm not sure we're even gonna do all of CRUD, you know?
Okay.
At least, maybe we will, maybe we won't, but we're certainly not gonna step outside of CRUD operations, so you won't have to do anything all that complicated with the databases. And even so doing, we will be able to do a lot of very interesting things. So, any questions? Yes?
I'm having trouble just getting the database back up since we dropped it.
Oh,
It doesn't work.
did you create a new database?
No.
That'll be the misstep you're missing.
Yeah, that's probably useful.
Yeah.
So you have to create the database and then
And then you can-
import
The
the
contents.
data. Okay,
Yeah.
that makes sense.
Yeah, so what the export in PHP MyAdmin does is it basically, it's like, okay, within the context of this database, I'm saving all the tables.
Yeah.
And then you have to have the database to, like, decompress the tables into it. Yeah,
It's like,
yeah. Make sense? Any
Yeah.
other questions? Good. If this is, if you find this topic somewhat mystifying, do not worry. We are basically stuck in databases land for the duration of the course, one way or another. So you'll have lots of time to practice. Thank you very much, everybody. I'll see you next week. And don't worry, I won't have a test for you next week.
will you have them work?
Let me ask you a question. Would you rather have assignment 3 or your test is graded?
That's hard.
Yeah, the answer is you would rather have assignment 3.
Okay, understood.
Yeah.